Photosynthesis. First, we'll do an overview. This overview is something we already did in the beginning of the year, so hopefully you remember this. Photosynthesis is when plants make their own food, and so their own food is sugar, and so hopefully you remember the equation for sugar. This is glucose, C6H12O6. Where do they get their carbon? They get it from carbon dioxide, so here's your arrow. This is what you get out, and here's what you put in. So if you're getting glucose, you must have gotten your carbon from somewhere. You got it from CO2. So this is something that plants do. So I should say plants got it from the CO2. And the H2O, well, you get you get the H from water, and the O's here. And so then the extra thing that you have at the end, if you count up all your O's, is some oxygen. So that's your byproduct at the end. That's the kind of the thing that the plants give off that's not what they were really trying to make. So here's a summary of it. You have sunlight, and you get that from, the sun or from lights if it's indoors. And plants get water absorbed from their roots. And the chlorophyll is a pigment that traps the sunlight, and what you end up with is sugar and oxygen. The oxygen is given off into the air, and we will use oxygen when we do cellular respiration, so the arrow would go the other way. And the sugar you can use right away if you're a plant, or you can convert it to starch, stored food in other parts of the plant. So what we're going to look at first is a little bit of background with some of the molecules. Some of it you already know. This is an energy molecule. You can see the base here and the sugar here and the phosphates. So this must be a nucleotide. It's the nucleotide with 3 phosphates. It's ATP. And it transfers energy really, really well. So we talked about this in a unit ages ago. ATP is not very good at energy storage, though. So you can't just be a plant and make lots of ATP and be done with it. What you have to do is store it short term as glucose and then longer term as starch. So one molecule of glucose stores 90 times the chemical energy as one molecule of ATP. ATP is pretty unstable, so it's really good for very, very short-term energy. So ATP is made in photosynthesis, but most of it's converted into glucose. And here is more background. Here's a plant pigment called chlorophyll. Pigments are molecules that can absorb light. So for example, in people, we talked about melanin a lot. That's a brown pigment that helps to absorb sunlight and protect you from the light, the UV rays from the sun. And here's chlorophyll A. It's got a magnesium in it and some nitrogen, a bunch of carbons. So that's a pigment that absorbs a certain type of light. Chlorophyll is the main light-absorbing pigment in autotrophs. Remember, an autotroph is something like a plant or algae. There's chlorophyll A, and there's also chlorophyll B. Now let's talk about light. We're going to define photon as a particle of light. So you usually think of light as waves, but a light can also be identified or described as a particle, which is kind of bizarre. But you can have particles, and they can have different wavelengths, longer ones or shorter ones. Light is made of different wavelengths, and we perceive different wavelengths as different colors. So here are some different wavelengths. Here's red, they're longer wavelengths, and here's purple, and they're shorter wavelengths. And we have different receptors in our eyes that can recognize red or green or blue, and so that's the combination of all that is how we perceive color. Absorption. So the pigment chlorophyll will absorb light. Different pigments absorb different wavelengths of light. Chlorophyll absorbs blue and violet and red the best. So you can see this is absorption right along here, and these are the colors of light, the wavelengths. So here are the short wavelengths, and you get the longer wavelengths. By that I mean short wavelength might be like this, and a longer wavelength would be like that. Anyway, this isn't wavelengths. This is showing you how chlorophyll absorbs. So chlorophyll absorbs blue light really, really well, and chlorophyll absorbs orange-red light pretty well. It doesn't absorb green light very well. It sort of bounces that back at us. So that's why we see green when we look out at organisms that have lots of chlorophyll, like plants. So chlorophyll reflects green, which is why plants look green to us. So that's the part that's not being absorbed. So if you have a plant leaf, the blue light would come in and be absorbed, and the green light would come in and be reflected, and the red light would come in and be absorbed, and the orange light would come in and be absorbed. So it's only the green that's getting reflected out for our eyeballs. Wow, that's a really pathetic eyeball. Anyway. something like that. That's a really bad eyeball. Sorry about that. So more about photons now. Here's an atom with its different wavelength, different energy levels. So photons of light can excite electrons in a plant's pigments. So here it is exciting an electron from the first to the second energy level, or from the first to the second, or the first to the third. So more energy would send it up further. Excited electrons carry the absorbed energy because when it comes back down, it can release that energy. Excited electrons will move to higher energy levels, which I just said. And now we'll talk about the structure of a chloroplast. So here's a chloroplast. It's a double-membraned organelle. These are one of those incredibly cool organelles that we talked about in the beginning of the year that have some of their own DNA, and we think they evolved from bacteria that invaded a eukaryotic cell. So that's why they're double-membraned. They have granum, which is this stuff. Let's move this back up again. Granum is a stack of thylakoids. So each of these little sacs is called a thylakoid. So this is an important word. Stroma is the goop in here. It's like cytoplasm, so it's the gel-like material around the grana. Biochemical reactions. So let me just go backwards a second. So these thylakoids have the pigment in them, so there are two reactions in photosynthesis, the light reactions and the dark reactions. The light reactions happen in the pigments and the other molecules that are in these membranes. And then the dark reactions can happen in the light, but they can also happen in the dark. And that happens here in the goop, in the stroma. Okay, so biochemical reactions. Let's look at this. So first we'll do a photosynthesis overview. Here's light, and it hits the thylakoids, and they've got those chloroplasts in them. And you take water, and that will make a couple of things. One of the side products that it will make is oxygen, but it will also make ATP and NADPH. So we're going to spend some time on this. You already know ATP. NADPH is just another molecule, and it carries electrons and hydrogen. You go over to this thing called the Calvin cycle. That happens in the goop. These are what you call the dark reactions, or the light independent reactions. So these you call the light reactions. Dark reactions isn't really a good name. A better name is really light independent reactions. It's just so much longer. Independent reactions. So that means they can happen in the light, but they don't have to. It's independent of light. It can happen in the light or the dark. So it takes the energy from ATP and it takes carbon dioxide and it sticks them together and it makes sugar. How cool is that? When you're done with the ATP, all you have left is ADP and P because you've taken the energy out of it. And when you're done with this carrier molecule, the NADPH, you take off the H and some electrons and you're left with NADP minus the H and minus some negatives. Come back to here, you use these things to make that plus the energy. So anyway, you have both of these that have to occur for photosynthesis to happen. Here's the structure of NADPH. It's this big molecule, and you don't need to memorize it, but I do want you to know that NADPH is a carrier molecule. It's a delivery boy. He brings stuff around. So he's got electrons and hydrogen that he's carrying around. So NADPH picks up two high-energy electrons, these things, and a hydrogen, a proton, from the light reactions to form NADPH. So that's the difference. NADP doesn't have these things. Now this little guy here is NADPH because he has the H and the electrons. NADPH carries energy to be passed on to carbon dioxide to make glucose. So you need ATP and this thing NADPH to put the carbons together from CO2 to make glucose, 6 of those. So the light-dependent reactions happen in the thylakoid membranes, and they use light energy, and they produce oxygen from water, and they convert ADP to ATP, and they also convert NAD plus to NADPH. So we'll see what that looks like. So here's an overview of it. You need water. You produce oxygen. So you've got the C6H12O6. To make that, you need CO2. Well, that has nothing to do with the light reactions. But the water, yep, you need that. So the light reactions need water. They also need light. and the other part of the equation is this plus some extra oxygen. So the light reactions take in water, release oxygen, and take in light. Don't have anything to do with this or this yet. That's the light independent reactions. But here are the middlemen, ATP and NADPH. So they do use ATP and NADPH. The way they got ATP was from ADP plus P. You use light energy to take these things and make ATP, and to take this one, NADP plus, with some hydrogen and electrons, and you make NADPH. So here's what that looks like in a little bit more detail, or maybe a lot more detail. So you have light energy here, and you get water, and you actually split water. How cool is that? And when you split water, some of the water is oxygen, and so, or oxygen makes up the water, so that oxygen is a byproduct. Goodbye, oxygen. See you later. I'll probably breathe you in someday. And then there's hydrogen. So there's a bunch of hydrogen hanging around here. Here's the light, and it sends an electron, one of these electrons that it got from here, sends it up an energy level, and it's passed on. Boom, 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 from one molecule to another molecule to another molecule to another molecule. And then this is photosystem 2, which was it's the first one that the plants used, but it was identified second, so that's why it has that name. Here's photosystem 1, and light hits that, and the electrons brought up another couple of energy levels, brought to another thing, another molecule and another molecule, and here's NADP plus, taking away those electrons and a hydrogen. And a couple of other things that you need to know: when the electrons are passed from one to another, they release a little energy. Some of that energy is used to take hydrogen and pump it inside. So now what you've got in here, because of the hydrogens made here, and because of the hydrogens pumped in from this thing, all these molecules that are transporting the electron around, these molecules are all called the electron transport chain. Uh-oh. I hope that comes back. Anyway, the electron transport chains, there we go, are a bunch of molecules that transport the electrons around. And while they're doing that, they lose some energy, and that energy is used to bring hydrogens inside. So what you've got is a bunch of hydrogens. And whenever you have a ton of something in one spot, that is potential energy. And you use that when it goes through here, it's like kind of makes this thing spin, sort of like with water falling over a dam. It makes the wheel spin. It makes this enzyme spin. And so this enzyme is called ATP synthetase, because syntha means to make, and ase is an enzyme. So this is an enzyme that makes ATP. So ADP plus P makes ATP when you use this energy from the hydrogens. Kind of crazy stuff. So the electrons in the photosystem 2, the sunlight comes here and it kind of pushes them up. So the electron acceptor here pushes the electron, and the electron, by the way, comes from water. And so you've got that, and because it was neutral here, but now you have a charged thing, so one of the electrons is negative, right, that's taken, and that leaves you with a positive hydrogen. So anyway, that's the electron. It comes from oxygen, so from water. So water is really the electron donor. And then it gets bumped way up here because of the sunlight, so it's given energy from the sunlight. As it's coming down the electron transport chain, it uses some of that energy to move hydrogen around. Boom, up again and down again. That electron's finally taken up by NADPH, or by NADP to make NADPH. So water is split in photosystem 2, and ATP is made, while the energy carrier NADPH is made in PS1. So photosystem 2 absorbs light energy. Remember, that's the first one, even though it's called 2. Electrons are energized and passed to the electron transport chain. Lost electrons are replaced from the splitting of water to form hydrogen and oxygen. Remember, if that's positive, the electrons must have gone somewhere else. They're negative. 2 hydrogens are pumped across the thylakoid membrane. That's a super big deal for the light-independent reactions that we'll see in a minute. High energy electrons are moved to photosystem 1, which is the second one, through the electron transport chain. Energy is used to transport hydrogen from the stroma to the inner thylakoid membrane. So you shove a bunch of hydrogens inside this thylakoid membrane. NADP plus is converted to NADPH, which finally accepts those electrons at the end. And there, remember, that's a delivery boy who's going to give the electrons to someone later. And hydrogen builds up inside, setting up this gradient. And that's potential energy. So guess what we use that for? We use that potential energy to make ATP. So ATP synthase in the thylakoid membrane allows the hydrogens to move out of the thylakoid down its concentration gradient. ATP synthase uses this energy to make ATP. So here you are making ATP. Chemiosmosis is when you have all these hydrogens built up in here. They come out and they force the ATP synthetase, the enzyme, to make ATP. So the summary of the light reactions is that you use water and light, and the products that you make are ATP and NADPH, and the byproduct is oxygen. Nothing to do with carbon yet. Finally, we're getting to the carbon cycle, the carbon part. So these are the light-independent reactions. We used to call them the dark reactions because they don't need light, though they happen in light all the time. So you have ATP and NADPH that you got from the light reactions. And then you're also going to need carbon dioxide from the air to make the sugars. And that's called carbon fixation because you're fixing carbon from the air into sugars. You stick it in the sugars, you fix it in there. 6 carbon sugars are made during the Calvin cycle, and that occurs in the goop, the stroma. So here's this crazy stuff. The light reactions made ATP and NADPH. Here's your ATP. So here's, I don't know how to even start with this. Let's start over here. You have to turn this cycle a whole bunch of times. So I'm going to go over it briefly because you don't need to know a lot about it, but think of 1 carbon dioxide coming in. This is a cycle, so it continues. You can't stop it. If you did, if you didn't have this stuff, you wouldn't be able to do any of this. So you always have to have this to start with. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons right here. And you put another carbon in to make 6, but it comes apart so fast. You can imagine splitting this and having 1, 2, 3 carbons with a P, right? 1, 2, 3. And 1, 2, you get another carbon from here, 3 carbons with a P. So you make a couple of those. Remember, I'm just talking about 1 instead of 3 for now, so I'm splitting these numbers in half. So I have a 3 carbon thing with a phosphorus on it. Then I use ATP, and I'm going to put another phosphorus on that side. So this is a higher energy molecule now. Now I'm going to get my hydrogen and my electrons that I had before, and I'm going to stick them on this to rearrange everything. It's going to release one of the phosphates, but it's going to rearrange the carbons in here to make them into a higher energy molecule. And so when it does this, I have just another molecule, G3P. If you have this molecule plus one other one, well, this molecule you can make GP3, and this you can actually put together, 2 of them together to make glucose. So yay, I've made glucose. But you can't use them all to do that because you have to take this G3P, use some ATP to put another phosphate on it to keep this thing going. So in order to make a glucose, you actually have to put in, you have to actually go around several times. So I think that's as much as I want you to know for that. So with the Calvin cycle, it takes a bunch of turns of the Calvin cycle to make 1 molecule of glucose. The reason we say 6 is because glucose, if you think about CO2 and you're making C6H12O6, you got to imagine you've got to go around 6 times. So CO2 molecules enter the cycle to form several intermediate compounds. And ATP and NADPH are used for energy to make the glucose. So you phosphorylate stuff and you put on some hydrogens and some electrons. A 3 carbon molecule, and you don't need to know the name of it, is used to regenerate the Calvin cycle. So factors, here's one of the most important things that you'll need to know for MCAS actually. Factors affecting photosynthesis, the amount of water available, right? And you know this because if you don't have enough water in your plants, they die. The amount of available light energy. So usually we think about sunshine, but you can certainly grow plants with light bulbs. And also finally temperature. Is it warm enough? Where did that go? Whoops. Where's my temperature, man? Anyway, temperature is the last one. Something's against me. It's true if it's too cold. Oh man. If it's too cold, it won't work. Okay, temperature, write it down. Bye.